Frederick, Colorado, August 13th, 2018, 1:48 a.m. The night was quiet in the subdivision of Saratoga Trail. The kind of quiet that settles over a neighborhood of identical houses with manicured lawns and basketball hoops and driveways. The ordinary, unremarkable silence of suburban America going to sleep. Nothing stirred. No dogs barked. The streetlights hummed steadily over empty roads. A car pulled into the driveway of 2825 Saratoga Trail. Shannon Watts was home. She had just flown in from Arizona, where she'd spent the weekend at a work conference for Thrive, the wellness company whose products she sold with infectious enthusiasm across her social media channels. She was 15 weeks pregnant with the couple's third child, a boy they had already decided to name Nico. She was tired. She was happy. She couldn't wait to climb into bed next to her husband and kiss her two little girls good morning when they woke up. She went inside. She never came out again. By the time the sun rose over Frederick that Monday morning, Shannon Watts, 34 years old, 15 weeks pregnant, was dead. Her daughters, Bella, 4 years old, and Celeste, 3, were dead. And the man who had killed them, her husband, Christopher Lee Watts, was already rehearsing the story he would tell the world. This is a story about what hides behind a smile, about the terrifying distance between the life a person shows the world and the life they carry in secret. It is a story about obsession, cowardice, and a methodical destruction of an entire family. But more than anything, it is a story about Shannon, Bella, and Celeste Watts, 3 people who deserved so much more than the fate they were given. Chapter 1: The Perfect Life. To understand what happened in that house in Frederick, Colorado, you have to first understand the world that existed inside it, or at least the world that appeared to exist inside it. Shannon Watts was, by all external measures, a woman who had built the life she always wanted. She had grown up in Spring Lake, North Carolina, the daughter of Frank and Sandra Rizasek. As a young woman, she had struggled with health issues, with finances, with a first marriage that ended badly. But she was a fighter, the kind of person who could walk through a difficult season and come out the other side with her chin up and a plan. She met Chris Watts in 2010. He was quiet and steady, an athletic man who worked as an operator for Anadarko Petroleum, a Colorado-based oil and gas company. He was attentive and calm, a welcome contrast to the drama she had known before. They married in 2012 in a ceremony that friends and family described as joyful and full of love. By 2018, they had 2 daughters, Bella, born in December 2013, and Celeste, born in July 2015, and a 3rd child on the way. They lived in a 4-bedroom house in a quiet development outside Denver. Chris had a good job. Shannon had built a side business with Thrive that she promoted enthusiastically on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, sharing testimonials, before and after photos, and daily updates about family life. She had thousands of followers. To those followers, the Watts family was aspirational. Shannon's videos were warm and candid. She'd film herself doing the school run, cooking dinner, sitting on the couch with Chris while the girls played in the background. She documented pregnancies and birthdays and ordinary Tuesday mornings with the same energy, as though every moment was worth preserving. Chris appeared in these videos often, quiet, smiling, an arm around his wife's shoulder, patient while the girls climbed over him. He seemed like the perfect husband, one neighbor would later tell investigators. Helpful, quiet, never any trouble. But what the camera couldn't capture, what Shannon herself may not have fully understood until it was too late, was that Chris Watts had been quietly disappearing from his own life for months. The financial reality behind the Watts household was considerably more precarious than the Facebook photo suggested. The mortgage on Saratoga Trail was significant. Shannon's Thrive income, while real, was inconsistent. Credit card debt had accumulated. In 2015, they had filed for bankruptcy. By 2018, they were behind on the mortgage and facing the very real possibility of foreclosure. Shannon knew things were tight. She worried about it openly with friends. But she also believed, the way people who love their families believe, that they would figure it out. They always had before. What she did not know, what she had no reason to suspect, was that her husband had, sometime in the spring of 2018, begun an affair with a woman named Nicole Kessinger. Kessinger worked in the same industry as Chris, and they had met through professional channels. She was younger than Sean and single, athletic. She and Chris began texting, then calling, then meeting in person. By the summer of 2018, Chris was deeply entangled. He told Kessinger that his marriage was essentially over. He told her he was unhappy and had been for years. He painted a picture of himself as a man trapped, counting the days until he was free. He did not tell her what he was planning to do about it. Chapter 2, the last weekend. On Saturday, August 11th, 2018, Shannon flew to Scottsdale, Arizona for a ThriveWork conference. It was the kind of event she loved: motivational speakers, product updates, time with colleagues who had become friends. She was visibly pregnant now, excited about the coming birth, still pushing forward with the work of building a life for her family. Chris stayed home with Bella and Celeste. What we know about that weekend comes from text messages, phone records, and later testimony. Chris told Sean and he had taken the girls to his parents' house in North Carolina. He had not. He had kept the girls in Colorado, and he had spent at least part of that weekend with Nicole Kessinger, possibly with the girls nearby, possibly while arranging for them to be cared for elsewhere. The details are murky in ways that have never been fully resolved. What is clear is this: by Sunday night, August 12th, something had shifted. Sean and texted friends expressing distress. She told at least one friend that Chris had told her over the phone that he no longer knew if he loved her. She was shaken. She had suspected something was wrong for weeks. Chris had been distant, cold, distracted. But hearing it said out loud, in the middle of her pregnancy, was something else entirely. She flew home anyway. She landed in Denver late Sunday night and got a ride from friend Nicole Atkinson, who dropped her off at Saratoga Trail just before 2 a.m. Nicole later said that Shannon seemed calm but tired, resolved to have a difficult conversation with her husband when she got inside. The neighbor's security camera caught Shannon walking toward her front door. She went inside. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. Chapter 3. The disappearance. At approximately 5:15 in the morning, Chris Watts left the house. Security footage from the street showed his truck backing out of the driveway. The truck was loaded. He drove to the oil field where he worked, a remote Anadarko site called Survey 319, roughly an hour outside Frederick. He spent several hours there, alone. Then he drove home. At 7:30 that morning, Nicole Atkinson called Sean in. No answer. She called again and again. Sean in was not the kind of person who ignored her phone. She was chronically, cheerfully online. Her silence was alarming. Nicole drove to Saratoga Trail. She knocked on the door. No response. She called Chris, who told her calmly that Sean had left early that morning. He didn't seem particularly concerned. Nicole was not satisfied. She called more friends. She called the HOA to get someone to open the door. She stood on the porch and called Shannon's name. Finally, around 1:30 in the afternoon, she called the police. Officer Scott Coonrod was the first to arrive. He noted that Shannon's car was still in the garage. Her purse was still inside. Her phone, the phone she essentially lived on, was still in the house, unplugged, face down on the floor near the bed. These were not the signs of a woman who had left voluntarily. When investigators made contact with Chris Watts, he appeared cooperative. He came home from work and spoke with police in the front yard. He wore a blue Anadarko shirt. He was calm. He answered questions without apparent distress. The police body camera footage from that afternoon would become one of the most watched pieces of evidence in the case. Not for what he said, but for how he said it. His eyes moved strangely. He shifted his weight from foot to foot. He spoke about his missing pregnant wife in a flat, distant tone, as though he were describing someone he barely knew. That evening, Chris Watts appeared on local news. Standing in front of his house, bathed in the warm summer light of a Colorado August, He spoke directly to the camera about Sean, about the girls. He said he hoped they were safe. He said he missed them. He said he wanted them to come home. He smiled once, briefly, at an odd moment. A small, involuntary curl of the lips that the internet would replay thousands of times in the days that followed, dissecting it, freezing it, asking the question that everyone watching already knew the answer to. Who smiles like that? The answer, investigators would later confirm, is a man who already knows exactly where his wife and children are. Chapter 4. The walls close in. Within hours of the news broadcast, law enforcement began building a case. The neighbor's security footage was reviewed. It showed Chris Watts' truck leaving that Monday morning around 5:15 a.m. A blanket-sized object was visible in the truck bed, something that had not been there the night before. Shannon's Fitbit data was pulled. It showed her heart rate spiking in the early morning hours before going silent entirely. Her phone had last transmitted a signal from inside the Saratoga Trail house. None of this fit Chris Watts' story. He was asked to take a polygraph test. He agreed. He failed it comprehensively. The examiner told investigators the results were unambiguous. On the morning of August 15, 2018, less than 48 hours after Shannon was reported missing, Chris Watts was brought in for a formal interview. The FBI was involved by now. Lead investigator Tammy Lee sat across from him. She was methodical, patient, precise. She laid out the evidence gently and without drama, piece by piece, like setting a table. The footage, the Fitbit, the polygraph. For a while, Chris Watts continued to hold his story together. Then, slowly it came apart. He told investigators that he and Shannon had argued that morning when she returned home. He admitted to the affair. He said that Shannon had discovered it, and that during the confrontation, she had strangled the girls. He said he had seen this happen and had reacted in a rage, killing Shannon in response. It was a story designed to transfer blame. It was false in almost every detail. Investigators knew enough by then to know they were looking at something different. Later that same day, August 15, 2018, Chris Watts was arrested and charged with 3 counts of murder in the first degree, 1 count of murder in the second degree for the unborn child, and 1 count of tampering with a deceased human body. He was 33 years old. He had been married for 6 years. His children had been dead for less than 3 days. Chapter 5. The oil field. The bodies were found at the Survey 319 oil site on August 16, 2018, after Chris Watts told investigators where to look. Shannon had been buried in a shallow grave near the perimeter of the property. The girls had been placed inside 2 large crude oil storage tanks, submerged in the liquid. The discovery shocked even experienced investigators. The deliberateness of it, the specific choices made about where to place each body, spoke to a kind of calculated thinking that was almost impossible to reconcile with a man who had stood in front of a camera smiling and asking for the public's help. Forensic analysis later determined that Shannon had been strangled. Bella and Celeste had been smothered. Bella, it emerged in one of the most heartbreaking details of the entire case, had not died easily. The evidence suggested she had fought, that she had regained consciousness, that her father had had to make a second, deliberate effort to ensure she was gone. This detail, when it became public, broke something in the people following the case. It broke something in the investigators who had to confront it. Bella was 4 years old. She loved unicorns. She had called her father her best friend. Chapter 6. The Double Life. As the criminal case moved forward, the fuller picture of Chris Watts' inner life began to assemble itself from the evidence. Text messages, phone records, interviews with Nicole Kessinger, testimony from friends and family on both sides. What emerged was not the portrait of a man pushed to violence by some sudden, unbearable pressure. It was the portrait of a man who had been quietly, methodically building the architecture of an escape, and had decided, at some point, that the only route out was through the worst act imaginable. Chris Watts and Nicole Kessinger had been exchanging hundreds of messages a day. They talked about their feelings, about their futures, about the life they might build together. Kessinger later said she had believed Chris was separated from Shannon, that the marriage was already over in all but name. She said she had not known Sean was pregnant until she saw it on the news. Whether Kessinger knew more than she admitted is something investigators examined carefully. Ultimately, no charges were filed against her. She cooperated with investigators and later gave a lengthy interview to a local news station in which she appeared genuinely devastated by what had happened. But the picture of Chris Watts that her testimony completed was damning. He had been lying to everyone simultaneously, telling Sean that everything was fine while telling Kessinger that he was nearly free, telling the public he was a grieving husband while knowing exactly where his family lay. The financial pressure was real. They were months behind on the mortgage. The foreclosure was imminent. But investigators and analysts have consistently argued that money alone does not explain what happened. What seems to have driven Chris Watts was something darker and simpler. He wanted a different life. He had persuaded himself he deserved one, and he was too cowardly to pursue it honestly. Divorce exists. Child support exists. Shared custody exists. None of these options, difficult as they might have been, ended in the deaths of 3 people. He chose differently. Chapter 7. The Guilty Plea. On November 6, 2018, less than 3 months after the murders, Chris Watts appeared in a Weld County courtroom and entered a guilty plea to all charges. He pleaded guilty to 5 counts of murder, 2 counts of first-degree murder after deliberation for the deaths of Bella and Celeste, 1 count of first-degree murder for the death of Shannon, 1 count of second-degree murder for the death of the unborn child, and 1 count of unlawful termination of pregnancy. He also pleaded guilty to 1 count of tampering with a deceased human body. The plea avoided a trial and avoided the death penalty, which prosecutors had been considering. In exchange, Chris Watts was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. When Shannon's mother, Sandra Zusek, stood up to deliver a victim impact statement, she read a poem she had written. Her voice broke. She spoke about her daughter and her granddaughters with the specific, loving detail of a woman who knew exactly who she had lost. Not missing persons, not case files, but Shannon, who loved Christmas. Bella, who wanted to be a doctor. Celeste, who called her grandmother every day. Chris Watts sat at the defense table and stared at the floor. Chapter 8. Confessions from Prison. In February 2019, investigators from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation traveled to the Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, where Chris Watts had been transferred for his own safety, to conduct a follow-up interview. What followed was a lengthy conversation that has since become one of the most closely analyzed documents in the case. Chris Watts, speaking quietly and with apparent calm, revised and expanded his account of what had happened on the morning of August 13th, 2018. He recanted the claim that Sean had killed the girls. He admitted that he had killed all 3 of them himself. He provided additional details about the sequence of events, how he had strangled Sean in their bedroom while she slept after returning home from her trip, how he had then gone to the girls' rooms. He described these events in a tone that investigators described as eerily detached, factual, quiet, without visible emotion. He talked about his victims with the kind of careful phrasing of a man who was telling the truth for the first time and finding it did not cost him what he had expected. He said he had been watching a YouTube sermon the night before. He said he had prayed. He had apparently found religion in the months since his conviction, a development that was met with deep skepticism by Shannon's family and by virtually everyone who had followed the case. What the prison confession added, more than anything, was clarity about the planning. The murders were not impulsive. Chris Watts had thought about this. He had considered it. He had driven to that oil field before. He had known the tanks were there. He had made choices. Chapter 9. Shannon. In the enormous volume of coverage that the Watts case generated, the true crime podcasts, the Netflix documentary, the books, the Reddit threads, the YouTube videos with millions of views, there is a genuine and persistent risk that the victims become secondary to the story of the perpetrator. This is a risk worth naming and resisting. Shannon Watts was not simply the wife who was killed. She was a person of remarkable energy and resilience. She had grown up dealing with health struggles, including lupus, and had found in the Thrive products a genuine sense of physical improvement that she wanted to share with others. Whether or not the product were everything she said they were, her enthusiasm for them was real. It came from a real experience of feeling better than she had before. She was known by friends and family as someone who never stopped moving, who filled every room she entered, who texted back immediately and remembered everyone's birthdays and showed up for people in the specific, practical ways that actually matter. She was fiercely devoted to her daughters. She was excited about the pregnancy. She had already started planning for Nico. Bella Watts was 4 years old and starting to develop the first contours of a personality. Curious, loving, prone to declarations of affection. She loved pink and unicorns and her baby sister. She called herself Daddy's little girl. Celeste Watts was 3, still at the stage of barreling through the world with total physical confidence and zero self-consciousness, the way 3-year-olds do. She had her mother's energy. She was always moving. Nico Watts was never born. They are gone because a man who had been trusted with their safety decided that his own comfort mattered more than their lives. That is not a complex psychological mystery. It is a simple, devastating fact. Chapter 10. Why it still haunts us. The Watts case became, in the months and years following the murders, one of the most widely discussed true crime stories of the modern era. The Netflix documentary American Murder, The Family Next Door, released in 2020, introduced the case to a global audience and was watched by tens of millions of people in its first month of release. Why does this particular case occupy so much space in the public imagination? Part of the answer is Shannon's social media archive. Because she had documented her family life so extensively on Facebook and YouTube, the public had access to something unusual in murder cases, a rich, detailed, moving record of the lives that were lost. Watching those videos after knowing what happened to the family creates an almost unbearable experience. You see Shannon laughing with her daughters, you see Chris Watts sitting in the background, and you cannot reconcile the image with the knowledge. Part of the answer is also the nature of the crime itself. Family annihilation. The killing of an entire family unit by one of its members is among the most psychologically incomprehensible categories of violence. It violates every basic assumption about what family means, what love means, what a parent's relationship to a child is supposed to be. And part of the answer, if we're being honest, is the same thing that draws people to true crime in general. The desire to understand, to make sense of the senseless, to find the warning signs that were missed so that we might recognize them in our own lives. The Watts case offers very few clean lessons. Chris Watts did not present obvious warning signs of violence. He was not known to be abusive. Friends and family described him as passive, even overly accommodating. Shannon did not live in visible fear of him. The marriage had problems, financial strain, emotional distance, a mismatch in their levels of engagement, but so do millions of marriages that do not end in murder. What the case does offer is a reminder about the limits of what we can know about another person's interior life, about how much can remain hidden behind a smile, behind a Facebook post, behind the performance of a perfect life. Christopher Lee Watts is currently serving 5 consecutive life sentences at the Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin. He is eligible for no parole. He has reportedly continued to correspond with people who have reached out to him since his incarceration, journalists, true crime enthusiasts, people drawn to the spectacle of his crime. He has given additional interviews and spoken about faith and forgiveness. None of this is of particular importance. What matters is this. On a quiet street in Frederick, Colorado, 3 people lived. A woman who worked hard and loved her family and documented every small joy she could find. A little girl who wanted to be a doctor. A little girl who barreled through the world like she owned it. And an unborn boy who never got the chance to become anyone at all.
Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If this story moved you, surprised you, or made you think a little deeper, don't forget to support the channel. Tap the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Your support means everything. It helps bring more powerful stories like this to life. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone else who needs to see it. See you in the next one.